All right, everything's working. Okay. Prior to starting the recording, I said that we were going to go through chapters 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 of Ulysses by Joyce. Today, trying to give it the conclusion that it deserves. If I leave a chapter or so on the table, that's okay. I will make the conclusion happen on Wednesday as I introduce Thomas Mann and Der Zauberberg, the Magic Mountain, to you, our second truly modernist work in the course as we approach the end of the course. Last time we concluded with, I read to you some of the funny sounds that exist in the Sirens chapter. And recall the Sirens chapter, like the traditional mythological siren who sings beautiful songs and lures sailors to their death, is a chapter that emphasizes sounds and the things that can be done with language. Something that we talked about that occurs to one's mind as one thinks about the notion of language and using language in distinct and different ways, using onomatopoeia, description, allusion, metaphor in ways that make language one's own. Stephen's desire as a great author seems to be to write in his own style, to write in his own vernacular, his own tongue. Though he technically uses English, as well as French, Italian, occasionally German, and Latin to spruce up his language, it is the case that both Haynes, the Englishman, as well as the Irish revivalists that we met in the National Library, want a return to a sort of a natural ethnic language of the Irish, the Gaelic Irish language. In fact, there's even a Gaelic league that we will run into today in the Cyclops episode that's trying to bring about old sports like the shot put, for example. We will meet an old shot putter who throw a biscuit box at Bloom, like Polyphemus once threw 2 rocks at Odysseus. In any case, keep in mind the distinction between writing with one's own prose, one's own individualistic style, compared to adopting an ancient language. Who is more Irish? An individual who learns Irish as a second language, who is taught English under British rule, and then attempts to write in a style of former Irish poets? Is that truly Irish poetry? Or is Irish poetry at this point in the game, in 1904, when this text is set, to be written in English, as most Irish people do speak, though it is not their ancestral language, that it is the language that actual Irish people who live in the actual world actually speak at this time. So when you think of what it means to be Irish, for example, for Stephen Dedalus, does it mean to be himself and all that is inside of him, all of his Catholicism, all of his philosophical learning, his connection to his father and his 12 siblings and all of the people around him? Or does it mean to pursue some sort of ideal that is in sort of a golden green past and to revivify this in the way that, again, we mentioned last time, Don Quixote seems to do with the chivalric ideal? Is Don Quixote right in his approach? Or is Stephen Dedalus right in his approach to creating something new in the world? In any case, that's all I have to say about Sirens. Cyclopes episode. We've talked ad infinitum, ad nauseum about this particular episode, and I've explained this episode to you a little bit as I've explained other episodes. But do recall, and I'm going to have to be very brief with this, this is one of the longer episodes during Odysseus's journeys. Know also that the vast majority of the magical journeys that Odysseus goes through, we do not see in the first-person narrative. We see it in second-person narrative. Odysseus tells of his great travels to a magical people. So even in the text of the Odyssey, we have to trust deceitful Odysseus that he is telling the truth, that he has seen Scylla and Charybdis and the Cyclops and Lycurgones and Cones and Lotus Eaters and such. We do not actually see that during the course of the narrative. We have that told to us by Odysseus' own narration. So we have to trust a very deceitful figure sometimes known for his deceit. Okay, I guess I was going to say one thing. Oh yes, okay, so I might have mentioned this last time, but right before I get to Cyclopes, let me mention that it is 4 o'clock during the Sirens episode. This is when Molly Bloom and Lady Boylan are finally supposed to meet. This is the event that Bloom, Leopold Bloom, has been dreading all day, and perhaps Molly Bloom has been looking forward to all day, but right down at the end of the description of what happens in the Ormond Hotel, which has a couple sirens in it, a couple barmaids who are singing to each other. There is a lot of singing in this chapter. Simon Daedalus gets a chance to sing. I think I have the Crappie Boy, which he sings. Its lyrics actually on a slide here. But Bloom is spying on Boylan until Boylan finishes his gin, leaves in his car. Bloom is early, it's very like Dante. Such an event happens in Dante, and of course, how does this this chapter that focuses on sounds end? Well, with a bit of flatulence by Bloom. He relieves his he passes gas, as we would say, which is actually something that happens at the very end of Canto 21 of the Inferno when Dante runs into these demons called the Malebranche. One makes a trumpet of his arse, as it were. Imagine the sound that a trunk makes for an elephant. Really are musically minded. But know that every episode, every chapter after this one, Bloom will now have the additional weight of knowing that his wife has cheated on him and he has been made a cuckold. This will connect very nicely to chapter 13. But chapter 12, we've talked about estrangement and Bloom's estrangement from the people around him, that he is perceived sometimes as ethnic Jewish, not Irish, that he is not one of the boys, but rather one of the, that he is not one of the boys, but one of the boys, or vice versa, as it were. There's something different about him. And he's even joked about as if he is a stereotypical Jew in the eyes of early 20th century Irish Catholic thinkers. The idea when he was in the Hades carriage that, or the carriage in Hades going to Patty Dignam's funeral, that he had not borrowed from Ruby J. Dodd because they shared a similar faith. They were both Jewish in that respect. In fact, there is a quote when it comes to usury, which is charging people at interest. We still have usury laws in the American states, but in Muslim countries, they're actually much stricter still, based on I'm forgetting exactly the biblical passage on which this interpretation rests. I'll think of it next time. I think it's Deuteronomy, maybe even 22:20. But it says, "Do not lend at interest to a neighbor." So historically speaking, at least in the Middle Ages, Christians interpreted that to mean nobody, and Jewish communities interpreted that to mean non-Jews. So there was a very different interpretation of a particular scriptural passage that led to a difference in practice that led, well, very obliquely to an eventual stereotype, or was part of what a stereotype eventually would end up developing. In any case, Leopold Bloom has very little to do with that. And he is continually shown that he is different in the eyes of the people with whom he interacts. Okay, so let's jump in. I was just passing the time of day with old Troy, the DMP at the corner of Arbor Hill there, and be damned, but a bloody sweep came along and near drove his gear into my eye. I turned around and let him have the weight of my tongue, when who should I see dodging along Stony Batter? Only Joe Hines. Okay, so the Cyclops episode in Homer's Odyssey is a tour de force of Odysseus' strategic cunning. A giant who does not honor the Xenia, the guest host's relationship, named Polyphemus, traps Odysseus and his men in a cave by placing a boulder over the entrance while Odysseus and his men were eating his cheese. Odysseus announces that he desires a guest gift, and Polyphemus responds that he does not fear the gods. Eat Odysseus last. He gobbles up two of Odysseus' men. He does this in the morning when he wakes up. He does this in the next evening when he comes back. Something like 6 or 8 of Odysseus' men are eaten in front of him in an enclosed cavern. They are not eaten bones and all. They are skinned and cooked. So Odysseus has to smell the burning flesh of his friends who die in front of him. Remember, he's also already seen some friends die in front of him. Scylla and Charybdis, he had to drag people back to him. Lotus Eaters, he had 70 men die during the Cacones episode. All of this after 10 years of war. Death, 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 death. This man is running into a lot. In fact, there was an SNL skit recently about young men talking to their fathers, and the idea is that fathers have trouble discussing intimacy. And so one of the fathers was played by Kenan Thompson, I think that's his last name. He grew up watching Good Burger, and can't remember his last name. Kenan Kel. That was his last name. But in any case, he's like, Dad, Dad's been going to or the Eagles, the dad doesn't talk about himself. It's like the Eagles have been going through a tough time. The Eagles have just been going through to a lot of funerals lately. And, the Eagles, they're not making the trades they need to make, and it's just getting tough for them. So he's obviously talking about himself. But the reason I bring that up, I'm forgetting entirely why I bring that up. Well, in any case, the joke is that older men can't express their intimacy in the ways that they need to, even to their sons. There was a connection there, but I'll have to see it in the recording and make it for us later. So Odysseus, I was discussing that Ulysses seen several of Odysseus' men. Yes. How does Odysseus get out of this situation with this giant who puts a boulder in front of the cavern and then eats men behind him? Well, he sharpens a large olive stick, waits till the Cyclops falls asleep. He gets the Cyclops drunk. He offers him very nice unmixed wine. That's like offering, I guess, somebody a very, very, very strong spirit, something like Everclear or something like that. It gets the Polyphemus extremely drunk. He then falls asleep, vomits, and imagine what's in his vomit that Odysseus sees, undigested pieces of his friend, very macabre, grotesque sort of image. Odysseus then, with several of his crewmates, then takes the olive stick, sharpened, jams it into Polyphemus's eye, and Polyphemus wakes up, now blind, and he wants to catch Odysseus. He doesn't have great sense of smell, can't see. So what he does is he moves the boulder out, and he allows his flock of sheep to walk out. While his flock of sheep is walking out, he's touching the tops of them. Keep in mind, the problem with this Cyclops is that he is a Cyclops. He has a single eye. He lacks depth perception. Only one eye. Not two eyes. Well, physically, you need two eyes in order to know how deep things are, how far they are away from you. Metaphorically, if one only has one eye, one has a limited perspective. One only sees one side of things. And how is this illustrated in the episode itself? Well, Odysseus and his men hide underneath the sheep in the rams. In fact, Odysseus physically is holding on to the hair of a ram, whereas the other men are tethered to the bottom. And in fact, Odysseus is tethered to Polyphemus' favorite ram that he addresses. He says, "Oh, favorite ram used to go out first in front of all of my sheep, but you must be crying and sad for your owner." You can see how he's using his imagination rather than his analytical skills. If your lead ram is all of a sudden much slower than it traditionally was, and there are people in your cavern, you might deduce what? That's weighed down by something, right? But he's just imagining, oh, you must be sad for me. Well, Odysseus then escapes underneath that ram, takes the ram with him, slaughters the ram, and eats it himself. You might think that's a little bit of justice after this Cyclops eats 8 of his men right in front of him. All right, and this happens at 5 p.m. So you can imagine that what happens in this episode, Bloom is in no mood to deal with, knowing what has just transpired in his life. He goes to a pub, Barney Kiernan's pub, and there he encounters a character who is in fact based on a real life individual who is only described as the Citizen, and his mangy dog, Gary Owen. The Citizen is a former thrower. Throwers throw shot put, sometimes they throw javelins, sometimes they do hammer toss as well. I might be missing one of discus as well. Throwers are power athletes, often very large. And this Citizen is a fervent nationalist, in fact, trying to bring about a new Irish National League of sports as well. He is anti-Semitic, so this gets Bloom, and he sits in the bar waiting to have a drink with popcorn while he shuffles about the Irish nationalist newspaper. So he's a bit of a sponger. He sits in the bar all day. We sometimes call such people barflies, and he waits for someone else to buy him a drink. This is like sort of a parody of what like a professor is, right? Like sits there so he can grant people his great knowledge from his propagandistic newspaper. Not exactly, well, ostensibly, ideally, not exactly the same thing. So so a couple of the moments where Gary Owen showed, or excuse me, Gary Owen, perhaps I would prefer to hear Gary Owen than the Citizen. the citizen shows his anti-Semitism in several different moments. A couple of key quotes here are you talking about the New Jerusalem, he says the citizen. Talking about injustice, says Bloom. There are multiple times in this discussion that the citizen tries to impugn Bloom for being non-Irish, to suggest that in some way Bloom is not one of them, is not an Irish individual. And so he suggests that he is one of the Zionists who are, and remember this is the early 20th century, the state of Israel was not yet recreated. And so the plans for creating a new Israel were first, you may know, developed by the Brits, by the British, who were the leading nation in the world at the turn of the 20th century. It was World War I and World War II that greatly vitiated their powers. They're no longer a great power, for example, but they were then. And so it was originally the idea that the Jewish state would be created by the Brits. Once they lost their power, the actual, became so vitiated they were incapable of producing a new state and defending it. That fell to the Americans. We were not a great power at the turn of the 20th century. We were becoming one, but it was really in the wake of World War I and World War II, with the vitiation of the great powers prior to us, that we attained that rank. It was really during the Cold War that we ascended to, a bipolar system at that time. We talked about politics later. In any case, this citizen is suggesting that Bloom is not Irish, but is rather a citizen of Jerusalem, would much prefer to go live in Israel rather than to live in Ireland. Are you talking about the New Jerusalem, says the citizen? Bloom says, no, I'm talking about injustice. But he gets pushed so far by the citizen and his anti-Semitism that he eventually erupts and is like, to put this in a bit of paraphrase and vulgar, he's like, listen, you ignorant, Irish barfly, there are plenty of people like me that have contributed much more to the world than you. And in this case, Bloom does accept his Judaism. He does identify with various figures like Moses Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn was a Jew. Karl Marx, obviously very famous, Das Kapital, socialism to some extent, was a Jew. Mercadante, great instrumentalist and composer, and Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, one of the greatest philosophers ever to exist, huge influence on Goethe and modernist philosophy in the 18th century. And his father was a Jew. Your God. It's true, right? Jesus, a lot of people don't think about this. Jesus was obviously Jewish. He was a Jewish rabbi. As Bart Ehrman of Yale describes him, one of their great theologians, says he was an apocalyptic Jew. And so this is a little bit much for the citizen to hear. Your God was a Jew spitting his vitriolic anti-Semitism. Whose God, says the citizen? Well, his uncle was a Jew, says he. The idea being, remember that the father of Jesus wasn't necessarily Joseph, but was, as Buck Mulligan says, the Holy Spirit, the bird. My father's a bird, and my mother's yeah. And so his uncle was at least Jewish, even if his father, God, was not technically Jewish. If you accept, that there was a holy father rather than just a physical father for Jesus, depends on your tradition and your own belief. He had no father, says Mark. That'll do now, drive ahead. Who's God? Again, responds the citizen because he's very upset, also drunk. Well, his uncle was a Jew, says he. Your God was a Jew. Christ was a Jew like me. God. He says, by God, the citizen. The citizen made a plunge back into the shop. By Jesus, says he. I can't say this very loud. This is bad stuff to say, but this is what's written here. I'll brain that bloody Jewman for using the holy name by Jesus. By Jesus is doing what in this case? What is he doing when he says by Jesus? He is using the name in vain of the God that he is claiming that his not really very Jewish, but who he claims to be Jewish interlocutor had used the name in vain. He says, what did you say about my God? It's by Jesus. And what does he say after this? Well, by Jesus says I'll brain. You may not know what braining someone is. It's horror movie season. It is to take some sort of sharp object or blunt object to one's head in order so hard that one's brain is emitted from one's head. It's like eviscerating somebody. That's when your guts are removed from you. Your viscera. And so it's a very violent thing to say, very bar sort of thing to say. But then, by Jesus, I'll crucify him. So well, it's funny. I think a lot of Americans think that crucifixion is a holy punishment. You know that was the Roman civic punishment. That was a Roman punishment originally. Paul, when he was crucified as a Roman citizen. And so when Jesus put to death, it's not a holy death. He was conspired against by the Pharisees, read the New Testament, but Cephas in particular, but the actual punishment itself, that was a way to execute that the Romans came up with. That was like our electric chair for them. So by God, I'll crucify. And keep in mind all the things that Bloom is doing. He's going to look after Stephen a little bit later because his drunken layabout father is nowhere to be found. Also, Stephen's friends, Buck Mulligan and Haynes, are going to abandon him while he is drunk in a house of ill repute. Abandoning their drunk friend, that's not very noble behavior. That's not very Odyssean behavior. Remember Odysseus, he takes his drugged friends with him. He doesn't leave them behind. The people that are left behind often are left behind because of their own mistakes, because they have to be. But so Bloom also, remember, is trying to help or will look after Mina Purefoy. In fact, that she's having a child in 3 days. He'll go to the hospital. He'll actually be there at the same time Stephen is drunk with his cronies. Prior to them going to the house of ill repute in Bella Cohen. Excuse me. But Bloom also is attempting to help the widow Dignam collect on the life insurance that Patty Dignam left but had borrowed against, and so it's unclear how much money she is supposed to get. And so Bloom is helping her. In fact, a very sort of negative stereotype threat sort of moment that Bloom encounters is that he wonders if she is seeking his help because the initial lender was Jewish, and so whether he has to wonder whether she thinks that he has some sort of affinity to this individual that would make it so that the outcome would come out more positively in her own favor. And that's the sort of thing that he has to sort of worry about because of the way that he is treated and seen by the people around him. In any case, I'll end this episode, this chapter, with what the Cyclops-like figure of the citizen does. It says, "Hold on, citizen," says Joe, "stop the citizen." Okay, and then begob, he drew his hand and made a swipe and let fly. Mercy of God, the sun was in his eyes. Or he'd have left him for dead. God, he's near sent it to the county Longford. He takes up a biscuit box, it's this box of cookies, and the sun's in his eyes. So what does that do to his accuracy? He can't even see this guy because he's blind, right? He's like the Cyclops. He doesn't see anything for what it really is, and he doesn't see straight, so he can't hit the mark at all. And so this guy is a farce. This guy is a joke, and he's trying to get on Bloom, this barfly who sits in the bar reading propaganda all day and tells the same stories all day long. Who is he helping? Exactly. Now, there are ways to see him as helping. Isn't he trying to bring about a new Ireland? Doesn't he hate the Brits? Doesn't he hate outsiders? It seems so. And yet, what is he doing that is productive to producing a new, better Ireland? Isn't his response to creating a new Ireland very similar to the Irish revivalists? Very different from Stephen and Bloom's ways of helping the world, though I don't think Stephen necessarily helps the world so much now, but we know that he's got something in him that will make a big difference. In any case, we come to chapter 13, Nausicaa. Look at what time it is. It was 5 p.m., now it's 8 p.m. A lot has happened. I'm not going to focus a ton on this chapter, except for to say this is the time when the onanism finally happens, when Bloom, who's very sad, knowing that his wife has cheated on him, sees a young, lovely maiden like Nausicaa, who's herself a young, lovely maiden from the Odyssey, who talks to Odysseus while he is naked he had just been at sea for 20 days and had to, and then his ship went down and he had to swim to this island, Scoria, and then bury himself in some leaves under a couple of trees, olive tree wild and cultivated. And then he woke up because he heard some girls near him, and he goes to approach them, wearing what he would be wearing after coming out of the salt sea and being under brambles and trees and leaves all night. And Nausicaa sees him, doesn't run away from him, addresses him, asks him to take a bath, and then invites him to her home. After he takes the bath, she sees him as much more fetching. Actually, there are three things that happen to Homeric individuals once they take baths. They become taller, they become stronger, and their hair curls. Their hair becomes curlier. You probably know the Mediterranean look, the old Greek look is very curly-haired people. And so, in the same way that in America, we sort of like straight hair, they really like curly. So the hair gets very, very curly. It's kind of funny. My mom has really curly hair as an Italian, and my dad didn't. And I was always really worried I was going to have curly hair. I mean, extremely curly. It's funny things we think growing up, but my hair's more like my dad's. So funny things growing up. In any case, the summer evening had begun to fold the world in its mysterious embrace. This is a beautiful start to a chapter. There's nothing funny going on in this language. This is Joyce showing that he can hold a high level. Far away in the west, the sun was setting, and the last glow of all too fleeting day lingered lovingly. What do we call that when two letters, same letter over and over again, some sort of literary thing? Alliteration? Yes. Notice the alliteration. All too fleeting day lingered lovingly on sea and strand. This is an Anglo-Saxon convention, by the way. Beowulf, for example, which is written in Anglo-Saxon, sometimes called Old English. Really shouldn't be called Old English because there's little relationship to modern language, English. But yes, alliteration is, or the alliterative style is what is used by the poet for Beowulf. So there will be 2 or 3 instances, not 4, of alliteration, of repeating the same initial sound in a word, like lingered lovingly, or sea and strand, or proud promontory, each line rather than rhyme. Something you may know about our own English. The English is not the easiest language in the world to rhyme, but it's much easier to use alliteration. So if you are to become a poet in our own language that we share, you may consider being an alliterative poet rather than a rhyming poet. And then you'll focus on the front of words rather than the end of lines. On the proud promontory of dear old Howth, guarding as ever the words of the bay, or excuse me, the waters of the bay, on the weed-grown rocks along sandy mount shore, and last but not least, on the quiet church whence there streamed forth at times upon the stillness the voice of prayer to her who is in her pure radiance a beacon ever to the storm-tossed heart of man, Mary, star of the sea. Third person narrator until Bloom finishes that. This is a beautiful introduction. And the correlate to this is, of course, the beautiful young lady Nausicaa, who gets up one morning and asks to wash her clothes in the stream to her father. Her father knows that this is her. She is asking to wash her clothes, but what she is really asking is that she look nice for potential suitors to show up. She's sort of in the situation that Princess Jasmine finds herself in at the beginning of the Disney's animated Aladdin, except for she hasn't had too many suitors come by yet. So she's right at the beginning of her courting, and is very excited about this. What man might show up? Who's going to be my husband? This amazing thing. And then Odysseus shows up, and he looks like a monster covered in mud and sticks. But then he takes a bath. He looks a little bit different after that. And sort of the interplay in this strange episode is that Odysseus wants to go home. This young woman sees him, and he's really, at first, nightmarish, but afterwards looks sort of like the man of her dreams. Strange, mysterious man who shows up. At first looks a little questionable, but then reveals himself to be worth much more than he initially seemed. And so nothing really happens between them. But when Odysseus is leaving, there's a poignant moment where Nausicaa says, and make sure that you never forget me, sailor, because she'll never forget him, right? He's the man that showed up on the day that she was expecting the man to show up for her. She'll never forget Odysseus. And the idea when she says that is that, you must run into a lot of people like me, so please don't forget me. And he promises not to. He's very obeying in that way. In any case, an older man, mysterious, foreign looking. This is Bloom in this instance. Note that he's a little bit darker than the usual Irish person. And one thing that Gertie McDowell notices, the first time we see anything like this, any mention of physical description of Bloom, besides, when he's using the bathroom, is that, so I might have it in here. I don't think I actually have it quoted here, but when she sees Bloom, she sees him as dark and handsome. So Bloom is to Gertie McDowell what Odysseus is to Nausicaa. So what's going on here? There are three girls, and they're sitting on rocks enjoying an evening scene. There's Sissy Caffrey, Edie Boardman, and Gertie McDowell. And they have a little bit of drama between them. In fact, Edie Boardman's getting on Gertie McDowell because Gertie McDowell's in love with the boy who rides the bicycle, but he recently spurned her for another lover. So she's feeling a little bit put upon as well. She has been spurned in a sort of childhood analog to the way that Bloom has been spurned. They're both hurting. So they're both going to share a bit of fictional moment. She's going to sort of preen and put herself on display. And an excellent quote here is that she looks over at Bloom, and Bloom is staring at her, clearly staring at her, like leering at her. This is the word that we use, to leer at someone. And she sees this, and she thinks, and Gertie McDowell knew that she had raised the devil in him. Excellent expression. But she sees that he's taking in her stockings and how she looks, and she likes it. She has herself recently been spurned. He himself, remember, has not laid with his wife. His wife has just cheated on him. He's looking for a substitute. And what a substitute? Onanism, masturbation, rather than actual sex, not an equivalent exchange. And this young girl from Molly Bloom, not an equivalent exchange, and something that will come out, something that is unseen and perhaps is some indication to the power of illusion and fiction and dating and in love, is that Gertie McDowell was actually concealing a maladaptation of hers. She is, as it turns out, when she gets up, a little bit lame. She can't run. And Bloom actually starts to feel sorry for him. This is after he's culminated his vicious, his vulgar act. And he returns to reason. He sees her walking off, and he starts to feel sorry for her. He thinks, oh, a deformed woman, that's a terrible thing. But they just go their own directions, very similar to Nausicaa and to Odysseus. They share something, but what do they share? Rather, is it anything more than just mutual projections of what the other represents to them? In any case, after the scene shifts back to his perspective, this is what he thinks. This is right after he has finished. All that for nothing. That's a good way of looking at that. Bold hands. Little double entendre there. He's not thinking of himself. He's thinking of Mrs. Marion Boyle. Did I forget to write address on that letter? Like the postcard I sent to Flynn, it's to Martha Clifford, his ridden lover. And the day I went to Drimmy's without a necktie, wrangle with Molly, it was put me on. It's about a fight with his wife. He didn't forget to take something out from his home. It's a very domestic situation. No, I remember Richie Goulding, he's another weighs on his mind. Funny, watch stopped at 4:30. What do you think happened at 4:30 that made his watch stop? Stops. It's precisely what you would expect. Dust, shark liver oil they used to clean. Couldn't do it myself, save. Was that just when she? Where does his mind return to after his very, very temporary relief, indulging in this fantasy where he stares, leers at this young girl? Where does his mind immediately go to? Well, the place that he actually is. Did my wife actually go? He doesn't 100% know. He knows that he saw boiling going there, and what was to stop that womb? Where was he? He was not stopped. In any case, chapter 14, the oxen of the sun. I'm going to talk a very limited amount on chapter 14 and 15. 14, like chapter 9, like chapter 3, is an extraordinarily difficult chapter. It is, there are two things that it is supposed to represent. Joyce shows that he can go through every English style of writing from Old English all the way to contemporary English as well. And what he is doing in that is showing the so-called gestation and evolution of language. What also is physically happening in this chapter is that Mina Purefoy is having her child. And so, well, let me just read a little bit of this to you. Des Hill Holis Gamus, Des Hill Holis Gamus, Des Hill Holis Gamus. Send us bright one, light one, horn, quickening, and womb fruit. Womb fruit. So this is a chapter about pregnancy and about delivery. And think about the connection between a woman delivering a child, which itself grows inside of her until it is ready to be delivered, and a writer generating a novel. This is, in some ways, the artistic masculine correlate or analog to female reproduction. A man cannot, unless you watch H.R. Geiger and watch Aliens, and a man can have an alien baby in the Aliens universe. But at James Joyce's time, there was really, and not in the wake of more contemporary views on particular issues like these. The case was that women could have children, but men could not. And so could men engage in an act of creation that was in any way equal to a woman's? And at least James's response to this is to create a book. And in so gestating his ideas and then bearing them out into the world, perhaps his book could have an effect on the world, like a person born into the world could have such an effect. This is an old idea. It goes back to Plato, who I've mentioned so many times, and his teacher Socrates, who described himself as a midwife. You know that midwives are the nurses that bear children. A midwife and OBGYNs are the physicians. A midwife of ideas. So he helped people through argumentation to clear up their ideas and to bear fruit in the form of ideas. And so this chapter is very difficult because not only does it go through several different registers and vernacular styles of English, but it is supposed to represent the process of the development of the human embryo. So it is supposed to represent a very technical, physical process. Okay? It is in fact described by Joyce as a foraginous chronicle, something that's just jammed packed. And Richard Ellman, in fact, one of the great critics of James Joyce, claims that Joyce spent 1,000 hours composing this chapter over 3 months of composition. So there is a lot in it. In Homer's Odyssey, Circe warns Odysseus to avoid an island called Phrygia, which is the Isle of Helios. Helios in the Odyssey is Hyperion. Hyperion is Apollo, god of the sun. God of the sun, also music and athletics, god of water. During a difficult storm, though, Eurylochus, the brother-in-law of Odysseus and the crew, insists that Odysseus moor the ship on a forbidden island. They do, but Odysseus makes them all swear not to eat Helios' cattle. After being trapped for a month, though, the men eat the cattle, again on the advice of Eurylochus, suggesting that starvation is the worst way to die. And Zeus throws a thunderbolt which destroys the ship and all on it except for Odysseus as a consequence, because he is the only person that did not eat the cattle of the sun. You should now be seeing the number of things that involve strange eating and consequences. Eat cattle of sun, die. Eat lotus, become addicted to lotus. Eat Odysseus's men, die. In the Circe episode as well, the men eat Circe's food, they are turned into pigs. Eat the wrong thing, consume the wrong thing in the Odyssey, and death is soon to follow. In any case, 10 p.m. now. We've skipped another hour. Bloom and Stephen meet in the hospital in an intern's waiting room. Stephen and his friends are already boisterously drunk. They will travel from here to Burke's pub. Bloom observes Stephen and thinks he is the best of the lot. Mina Purefoy, and this is itself a pretty unique judgment. Most people, when they see Buck Mulligan and Stephen, think Buck is the stuff. And there's a lot about Buck. You know, he's a strapping young man, he's loud, he's a medical student, and he recently saved a young person from drowning. There's a lot that recommends Buck to people's minds. Not as much that recommends Stephen, yet something that Leopold Bloom alone sees in Stephen, something special in him, casts his Greeker than Greek eyes on him, though this was just projection of Buck Mulligan. Mina Purefoy, who is in her third day of labor, finally has her child in the middle of the chapter. James Heffernan explains this chapter is structured to parallel the process of gestation or autogenesis, intonation right when new syllables appear is often difficult, of a human fetus, and also to pay heed to the history and development of the English language. All right, chapter 15, Circe of Nighttown. This is about a 150-page chapter on about a 900-page book. So it's about 6 in the entire deal. I'm not going to say too much about this because we didn't read this together, largely because it is giant and phantasmagoric and very stream of consciousness. It is like going through a haunted house made of ether, or which is itself not a very good description. It's like moving through a cloud, going through this chapter for the first time. It's very hard to see what is actually there. In any case, the chapter starts with magistrate entrance to Nighttown, before which stretches an uncobbled tram siding set with skeleton tracks, red and green will-o'-the-wisps. Remember, will-o'-the-wisps are empty flames, ignis fatui, and danger signals, rows of grimy houses, gaping doors. Note that this sounds a lot like hell. Rare lamps with faint rainbow fans, round rabaiotis, halted ice gondola, stunted men and women squabble, stunted. They grab wafers, between which are wedged limps of coral and copper snow, good alliteration. Sucking, they scatter slowly children. The swancombe of the gondola, high-reared, forges on through the murk, white and blue under a lighthouse. Whistles, all as answer. Interesting. Bloom's lost potato. He has been carrying a potato with him during the course of the day, something like a talisman that was given to Odysseus by Hermes when he goes to encounter Circe. Is given a little black and white plant called moly, M-O-L-Y, that my students often read as Molly, black to themselves. But that talisman kept Odysseus, when he eats Circe's food, from turning into a pig. This potato that Bloom has when he goes to a house of ill repute prostitutes, where Bella Cohen is the madame of the place. And that's what they're called. The female pimp who owns the home. One of the prostitutes will take Bloom's potato. When she takes his potato, things start to get weird and transformative. And it becomes much, much harder to tell the difference between illusion and reality in this chapter. This is supposed to mimic getting really drunk and it being really late at night. It's 12 a.m. now. Nobody except for Bloom, and Bloom not even very well, is thinking extremely straight at this moment, except for him. And in fact, Bella Cohen will then turn into Bella Cohen. She will turn from female to male, and she will become a dominatrix on Bloom. She will be humiliating him and insisting that he, like one of her prostitutes, do her bidding. Eventually, though, Bloom does get his potato back, and his wits return to him. And he keeps Stephen from being overcharged for a lampshade that he destroys in his drunkenness. Bella Cohen says, he destroyed my lamp. And Bloom, in his usual pragmatic way, says, he didn't destroy the lamp, it's just the shade. Here are a couple cents. But remember, Stephen, in his sort of drunken state, if he's told that he's being overcharged, is he going to be able to haggle with anybody at this point? No, he needs help. So who is there to help him? Person that we've seen around town in Ireland, in Dublin, in 1904 on Bloomsday helping. Perhaps you're starting to see some of the why it's called Bloomsday rather than Stephen's Day. In any case, outside once they've gotten outside of the house of ill repute, Stephen gets into a drunken disagreement with two soldiers. One of them keeps insisting and says, "What did you say about my bleeding effing king?" Because Stephen is drunk and says he doesn't want to have a king. He's not English. He is British, but remember, he's Irish, not English. So outside, Stephen gets into a drunken disagreement with two soldiers. Bloom and Corny Kelleher let the officers of the law know that Stephen was just having a bit of fun, and to let him off. Corny Kelleher, who shows up in this moment, is actually a police informant. This is something that Bloom knows. So when Corny Kelleher tells the men, hey, he's just having a little bit of fun, the guys know who he is, and so they accept the authority of this police informant, and then they go on their own way. So this chapter then ends with a very powerful, very sad image. Bloom has just met Stephen for real. He's starting to take him into his care. He's acting in a fatherly way. So what image occurs to him at the end of this chapter? Well, Rudy, his son that only lasted 10 days, appears as a fairy boy of 11. He is reading right to left. This means that he's reading Hebrew, could be Arabic, almost some of the Hebrew, and kissing the page. He's like a perfect young man. This is what Bloom imagines right after pulling drunken Stephen out of a bad situation into another bad situation, but is now going to finally try and get him cleaned up at a cabman's shelter, which we will talk about on Wednesday when we conclude the text. All right, thank you.